This talk and then the one after it will be on Robert Venturi. This one really kind of about Venturi's own background, and then the next talk will be more about the work. And we're really looking at Robert Venturi as theoretician and as practitioner. He, of course, wrote Complexity and Contradiction, which you're about to read. If you think of Toward a New Architecture as the most influential architecture book in the first half of the 20th century, it's very easy then to see Complexity and Contradiction as the most influential architecture building in the second half of the 20th century. And then Robert Venturi, you know, as a really prolific architect, spends a very, very long career really working through the ideas that he developed back in that book. And he's very, very parallel in many ways to Le Corbusier. Both of them had some practice in their early career with very, very prestigious firms, and then took a pause, and for several years really were concentrated on theory, wrote their book, and then came back and practiced architecture in a very sophisticated way for the rest of their career. So Robert Venturi was born in 1925 in Philadelphia. His father was a very, very successful, you might say, greengrocer. He owned a huge produce company in Philadelphia, Venturi Produce. And his mother was a very big activist, especially an activist for pacifist causes. So he grew up in an affluent family, went to the very best schools in Philadelphia, and got an extremely good education. His father, it turns out, was quite an architecture buff, would take little Robert around to see great works of architecture. Venturi was fond of remembering a time when he and his father were in Penn Station, the old, unfortunately demolished Penn Station in New York. And his father was just so thrilled about the scale and the magnificence, and he was kind of rubbing off on little Robert Venturi as a child. He went to Princeton for his undergraduate work, graduated in 1947, summa cum laude, super smart guy. He then went on to graduate school at Princeton as well, and graduated in 1950 with his master's degree in studying architecture. One of his teachers there was very famous, teacher of architecture and theory, a guy named Jean Labatut. He credited Labatut with having an enormous influence on him and on really learning to think about architecture. When he graduated in 1950, he went to work for a very well-known architect in Philadelphia named Oskar Stonerov. Stonerov was probably best known for urban design and for design of low-income housing, but very, very well-respected architect. Worked there for a couple of years and then went to work for Eero Saarinen. Saarinen would have been, of course, probably the preeminent American architect of the era. And this was just at the moment when Saarinen was at the peak of his career and doing extremely exciting projects. Worked there for a couple of years until 1954. And then in 1954, he got this incredible opportunity. He won the Prix de Rome, which is a fellowship, to go and spend time at the American Academy in Rome, and for a year just study, do what you want to do, think, explore, expand your capabilities. And so he went to Rome to do that, spent a year at the American Academy, extended his stay even beyond the time he was officially supposed to be there, and spent about 2 years in Rome from 1954 to 1956. This was primarily the time when he's thinking and developing the ideas in Toward a New Architecture. He, of course, is immersed in especially Renaissance and Baroque Rome, Michelangelo, Borromini. He's going to the hill towns in Tuscany. He's just immersing himself in this gorgeous, amazing architecture and thinking in broader terms. What does that mean for now? What does that mean for me as a practitioner? What can I learn here? Then he goes back to the United States, and from 1956 to 1958, he works for Lou Kahn. Again, this was earlier in Lou Kahn's fame than it was in Saarinen's fame. But he worked for Kahn when he was just beginning to get to be a well-known architect, but of course would become incredibly, incredibly influential as an architect in the US. So he spent a couple of years working for Lou Kahn and became very, very good lifelong friends with Lou Kahn. Then he broke out on his own in 1958, and he had several partnerships. There was Venturi and Short. That didn't last too long. Then he had a partnership with John Rauch, Venturi and Rauch. That lasted a bit longer. So he was doing small projects, but in that period of time from 1958 to 1976, he's a productive architect. In 1967, about the middle of that period, he marries Denise Scott Brown. Now, this is a very, very important event in his career, because from that point on, Denise Scott Brown is a partner in thinking, a partner in designing, a partner in every way. And he gave enormous credit to Denise Scott Brown, and all of the buildings that come after 1977, one has to say that is both Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi. And this becomes a really amazing, amazing duel, two incredible intellects. Denise Scott Brown was from Zambia in Africa. She was, before they married, a very successful urban designer and urban theorist. She was very interested in social theory and in urban theory, probably expanded Venturi's range in those areas, and very, very interested in vernacular and mass culture. What the firm got to be known for, a great deal of that is really Denise Scott Brown, what she brought to that partnership in 1967. She did not officially become a named partner in that firm until 1977, when the firm became Venturi, Rauch, and Scott Brown, and then eventually became just Venturi and Scott Brown. And that's probably the work we know the most of them from them is really out of that Venturi and Scott Brown era. Now, all that time while he's developing his practice, Venturi is also teaching. And he taught theory very regularly from 1951 to 1965 at Penn, University of Pennsylvania, in the School of Architecture there. Lou Kahn would have been one of his colleagues teaching there through that period. And then in 1966, kind of at the end of that period, is when he published Complexity and Contradiction. And it was the combination of the time he spent in the American Academy in Rome, where he was developing these ideas and doing a lot of the writing, and then this period of teaching theory and really working out some of those things with his students, that the book was produced. Now, he actually wrote the book a little earlier than 1966, but he had a hard time getting it published. It was radical, and it was odd, and normal people who published architecture books were not interested. There was a guy named Arthur Drexler, who was the curator of design at the Museum of Modern Art, quite an influential figure in the design world. Venturi sent him a draft of the book, and Drexler understood, oh my God, this is an incredible, incredible work. This needs to be published. And so he convinced the Museum of Modern Art to publish the book. Now, the Museum of Modern Art was not a publisher. And they published this book in the strangest format. This was the original book. It's tiny little pamphlet. The illustrations in it are like postage stamps. Very hard to read, very hard to understand, because he makes so much reference to those buildings, but you can't freaking see them. But that was the book that I first saw when I was in architecture school. And it did not sell well. I mean, for one thing, Museum of Modern Art didn't know how to promote a book like that. So it was kind of unknown, but it kind of seeped out. And when I was a student, I can remember somebody getting it, reading it, thinking, holy moly, this is earth-shattering. And that book got passed around till it was in tatters, and we all read it. and thought about it. And it began to have an influence in a kind of underground. And then finally, it gets to be distributed more widely and more people get it. And it becomes extremely, extremely influential by the 1970s, 72, 73. Around there, it began to be in much more common distribution. Now, there were 5 things, I think, in this era that are influencing Venturi and influencing the book. The first is a kind of burnout of modernism. There had been an unfortunate codification of modern architectural thinking in the 1950s. And, it was books like Hitchcock and Johnson's International Style that just kind of made, okay, here are the rules. This is how you do this. And it was a little dumbed down modernism. But that codification had done some bad things for modernism, and Venturi was rebelling against that. A second thing was this notion in the larger culture about recapturing history. There's something we could learn from history. In the post-war period, there was an enormous rejection of the past. This horrible war had just happened. Anything old was bad. Let's get the hell away from that and forget it. But there was now, with a little more reflection, a resurgence of interest in history. And an example of that might be on Broadway. Leonard Bernstein, the great composer, does this, earth-shattering new musical called West Side Story. And it really takes the story of Romeo and Juliet. It takes Shakespeare, it completely reframes it, puts it in a different context, and retells the story as a musical. And it had enormous power. That was done in 1957, just as Venturi is kind of grappling with these ideas. So that was in the air, this notion of reusing history. Then a third thing is that this was the era of the beginning of pop culture. And art in particular was being very influenced by pop culture, and people like Andy Warhol or Roy Lichtenstein or Klaus Oldenburg. They're taking ordinary everyday things and they're reframing them and rethinking them, and they're making art and they're making statements out of that. They're using the media, TV and print medium and advertising as kind of fodder for a new visual world that we were entering. So all of that pop culture has a big influence on Venturi. Then the fourth thing is it also was a period after the war. American economy just began to really rev up and produce stuff. There was an enormous production economy in the post-war period. And by the 1960s, everybody's got stuff, appliances, cars, TVs, houses, there just is so much stuff being produced. And it's being produced largely mass production. So now there begin to be production items, off-the-shelf things you can purchase and, for instance, in the building industry, put into buildings. So that's a huge influence on him. And then the fifth and final thing is really just the intellectual context of postmodernism. And this was happening in philosophy and the arts and literature, all over this sense that there was a new way of thinking, not about things that are pure, but about things that are hybrid, not about things that are clear and simple and straightforward, but things that are a little distorted and kind of beautiful for it. Things that are not necessarily just interesting, but maybe even boring stuff is fine. All of these were in this kind of larger intellectual notion of postmodernism. So in the next talk, we'll be looking at how that begins to influence the kind of practice that Venturi does.